Presiding Officer, Scotland is a country renowned worldwide for its reputation for shipbuilding. For generations, we've been a leader in engineering, manufacturing and craftsmanship. So why does John Swinney think Scotland isn't capable of building his own ferries?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I think Scotland is able to take forward its shipbuilding activities, and we have many examples of that being the case. And the Government has intervened using our economic development powers and interventions to support that over a number of years. Because if it hadn't been for the actions of this Government and the actions that I took as a Minister in the past, there would be no constancy of work at Ferguson's Marine, and I make no apology for putting it in that direction.
Anas Sarwar.
With the SNP, it's contracts going abroad. This week, it's jobs for Poland. 4 years ago, it was jobs for Turkey. So much for Stronger for Scotland. It's the SNP Stronger for Poland, the SNP Stronger for Turkey. I want the ferries to be built here in Scotland. I want
Let's hear Mr Sarwar.
I want the jobs. I want the ferries to be built here in Scotland. I want the investment to be here in Scotland. I want the jobs to be here in Scotland. We have world-leading shipbuilders at Port Glasgow, Govan and Rosyth. We have a publicly owned shipbuilding company, Ferguson's, we have BAE and we have Babcock. I want Scotland's shipbuilders to be able to bid and win these contracts, but John Swinney believes none of them are good enough to build Scotland's ferries. So what is it about the way SNP run Ferguson's, and what is it about the way the SNP do procurement that means Scotland's ferries can't be built in Scotland?
First Minister.
I don't believe any of the guff that Mr Sarwar suggested is any of my views. Absolutely.
First Minister. Let's ensure our language is courteous and respectful.
Well, let me rephrase my question. I don't believe any of the nonsense that Mr Sarwar purported to be my view. We've gone through a competitive tendering process in which Ferguson Marine have been part of that competitive tendering process. So it follows from that I believe that yard is perfectly able to build the ships because they're part of the tendering process and they got through that tendering process to put in a bid that was credible and to be considered. But what ministers cannot do is that ministers cannot operate outside the law. We've got to follow. Well,
Mr Mara.
We've got to follow the procurement law that is in place. We've got to follow the legislation as part of the United Kingdom Subsidy Control Act, which is an obligation on all of us to make sure that ferry tenders are determined on the basis of an open procurement process. So, whilst I would love the vessels to be built at Ferguson Marine, of course I would love that because that's why we're putting in £14.2 million over 2 years to support Ferguson Marine develop their capability. I want that to be the case, but I've got to make sure that we procure our ferry vessels in accordance with the legislation that's in place in the United Kingdom.
Anas Sarwar.
John Swinney sends investment and jobs to Turkey, he sends investment and jobs to Poland, and people in Scotland will think it's nonsense that he's not building ferries here in Scotland. And the consequence of SNP incompetence is stark, because it's not just investment and jobs going abroad. At the heart of this are island communities that have been failed. Islanders missing out on hospital appointments. They've missed weddings. They've missed loved ones' funerals, and their livelihoods are being destroyed. The Fraser of Islander Institute estimates that disrupted ferry services cost the Isle of Arran alone up to £170,000 a day in lost revenue. That's devastating for an island. And in Uist, Stephen Peter Anna, the managing director of a hotel group which employs 70 people on the island, said, "We as a team have spent over 4 decades building a sustainable business, only to watch CalMac and the Scottish Government shrink it over the last 5 years." So what does John Swinney say to Stephen, his family and his staff, whose livelihoods this SNP government is putting at risk?
First Minister.
Well, what I would say to Mr Perrana, who I have met on many occasions and for whom I have got great respect, is that the Scottish Government is investing in the ferry network, and we have commissioned the Glen Sannox and the Glen Rosa from Ferguson's. We have 4 large vessels coming from the Chemri yard in Turkey, and there are 7 small vessels being procured by the Government. Now, when the Government came to office in the 2006-07 expenditure on ferries in Scotland was £90 million. In the forthcoming budget, which Mr Sarwar did not support, it is going to be £530 million. £530 million, a 23% increase in funding levels on last year. So what I would say is...
Let's hear one another.
So what I would say is that the Government is investing in the ferry network. We've procured 6 large vessels to join the network. We've got 7 smaller vessels that will be joining the network over time, and the Government is putting up the money to support that. Now, Mr Sarwar has talked about the Ferguson's yard, and let me just remind Mr Sarwar of what the GMB wrote to Mr Sarwar in 2022. What Mr Sarwar was told by the GMB is that the Labour Party's approach to the situation at Ferguson's is so disappointing. That's what the GMB told Mr Sarwar. Why? Because Mr Sarwar and his colleagues, who are repeatedly shouting at me today, have done what the Tories have done for years. They've run down Ferguson's while this Government has supported Ferguson's, and I'm making no apology for that today.